For 30 years, scientists built museums around him. They sculpted his face, painted his skin, grew his hair. School children across the world looked at his reconstructed image and believed they were seeing the face of ancient Europe. They were looking at a lie, not a small lie, not a minor inaccuracy, a complete, fundamental, embarrassing misrepresentation of one of the most important human beings ever discovered. And the worst part, the people who built that lie weren't guessing, they were using science. They were just using the wrong science, and now new DNA evidence has changed absolutely everything. There is a body locked inside a temperature-controlled chamber in Bolzano, Italy, kept at precisely minus 6 degrees Celsius and 99% humidity. Security cameras watch him 24 hours a day. Scientists have to wear full protective gear just to enter his room. Millions of euros have been spent preserving him, studying him, decoding him. He is not a king. He is not a conqueror. He is not a prophet or a philosopher whose words shaped civilization. He is a dead man who fell face down in the snow 5,300 years ago, bleeding out from an arrow wound that pierced his left shoulder and severed a critical artery. And yet, in the world of archaeology and ancient human genetics, he might be the single most important individual ever found. His name is Ötzi, and everything we thought we knew about him has just been torn apart. For over 3 decades, the world pictured the Iceman as a rugged, fair-skinned, hairy, prehistoric figure braving the freezing alpine winds. Museums in Austria and Italy built entire exhibitions around that image. A reconstruction of his body, lifelike, eerily detailed, showed a man with pale skin, a full beard, thick wild hair, and sharp, piercing eyes catching the mountain light. That reconstruction became iconic. It appeared in documentaries and textbooks and magazines. It became the face of ancient Europe. Scientists pointed to it proudly and said, "This is who we descended from. This is where it all began." But here's the problem. That image was built on contaminated data, outdated technology, and a set of assumptions so deeply embedded in the scientific community that nobody thought to question them for more than a decade. And when researchers finally did question them, when they went back to the raw genetic material with modern tools and a fresh set of eyes, what they found shattered the picture entirely. In 1991, 2 hikers found Otzi emerging from the snow, lying face down high in the Ötzi Alps between Austria and Italy. His leathery body had been naturally mummified by a mixture of ice, sun, and wind. He had been there for 5 millennia, perfectly preserved in the glacier, completely invisible to the world until a freak melt exposed him. What the hikers found that September morning was not just a corpse, it was a time capsule, a frozen snapshot of a human life from the Copper Age. He was carrying tools, wearing clothes, holding weapons. He had food in his stomach. He had diseases in his blood. He had tattoos on his skin. He had secrets locked inside his cells that nobody in the 21st century had yet learned to read correctly. In 2012, scientists sequenced his genome, one of the first ancient genomes ever sequenced. It was a monumental scientific achievement. The technology was cutting edge for its time. The results made headlines around the world. Researchers announced with confidence that Ötzi had pale skin, blue eyes possibly, and most strikingly, that he carried ancestry from ancient herding people who came from the eastern steppes of Europe and Central Asia. This last finding puzzled researchers from the very beginning because, as they acknowledged, steppe ancestry wasn't supposed to arrive in Europe for another 1,000 years after Ötzi lived. But the data said what it said. Scientists published their findings, journals accepted them, and the world moved on, accepting this picture of Ötzi as settled truth. Think about what that means. A scientific conclusion acknowledged to be strange and contradictory from the very beginning was simply accepted, embedded into the global scientific understanding of prehistoric Europe, and repeated for over a decade. And all of it, every uncomfortable anomaly, every nagging question, turned out to trace back to one devastating flaw in the original methodology. The initial analysis of the Iceman's genome revealed genetic traces of steppe herders. However, the refined new results no longer support this finding. The reason for the inaccuracy? The original sample had been contaminated with modern DNA. Contaminated. Someone else's genetic material had found its way into the ancient sample. Modern human DNA had mingled with 5,000-year-old DNA, and the sequencing technology of 2012 could not reliably distinguish between the two. The scientists weren't lying. They weren't cutting corners. They were working at the absolute frontier of what was possible in their era. But the conclusions they reached were wrong, and the image they built from those wrong conclusions became the official face of the Iceman for more than a decade. And this is where everything changes. A research team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig and the Institute for Mummy Studies at Urach Research in Bolzano analyzed the Iceman's genome using the latest sequencing methods, correcting previous findings regarding Ötzi's genetic descent from populations that migrated from the eastern steppes. This was not a minor refinement. This was not a subtle update to an existing theory. This was a fundamental reconstruction of who Ötzi was, where he came from, and what he looked like. The new study, published in August 2023 in the journal Cell Genomics, used high-coverage genome sequencing that remapped more than 90% of Ötzi's entire genetic code. They compared his genome against a dataset of more than 10,000 prehistoric individuals studied from across Europe. The picture that emerged was so different from the one built in 2012 that it made the earlier reconstruction look almost unrecognizable. Let's start with the most visible thing. The thing that's been staring scientists in the face for 30 years, preserved right there in front of them, and which nobody wanted to believe because it didn't match the story they had already decided to tell. The analysis of his genetic makeup has revealed the 5,300-year-old mummy had dark skin, dark eyes, and was likely bald. This stands in contrast to the reconstruction of Ötzi that depicts a pale-skinned man with a full head of hair and a beard. Read that again. Dark skin, dark eyes, bald. The man who had been sculpted as a rugged, pale-skinned, wild-haired European mountain dweller was, in biological reality, a dark-skinned, dark-eyed, balding man in his mid-40s. The reconstruction, the face that had become the definitive visual representation of prehistoric Europe in museums, textbooks, and documentaries around the world, was built on biases, not on evidence. And the scientists who built it knew something was off, but couldn't quite bring themselves to challenge the assumption. If you think about the appearance of the mummy, it's actually bald and it has dark skin, yet it was still reconstructed with lots of hair and light skin, said study co-author Johannes Krause, a geneticist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. This reflects our own biases in assuming what a person from that time looked like. This is a remarkable thing for a scientist to say publicly. It is an admission that the people trusted to look at evidence with clear eyes instead saw what they expected to see. They looked at a mummified body with dark, leathery skin and an almost hairless head and thought, that's the mummification. That's what happens when you freeze a body for 5,000 years. And then they built a completely different image and called it science. It was not science. It was assumption dressed in a lab coat. But the appearance was only the beginning. The deeper revelation was genetic. And genetically, Ötzi turned out to be something that no researcher had fully anticipated. An outlier. A man who did not fit into the population patterns of his own time and place. A human being who, the more you study him, the more mysterious he becomes. The high-quality genome analysis shows that Ötzi had a significant early Anatolian farmer ancestry, suggesting he was part of an isolated alpine population. Anatolian farmers were the ancient agricultural communities that spread out from the region we now call Turkey, modern Anatolia, and moved westward into Europe beginning around 9,000 years ago. They were the people who brought farming to Europe. They were the architects of the Neolithic revolution on the European continent. And by Ötzi's time, 5,300 years ago, their descendants had spread across much of Europe. But they had also been mixing with other genetic groups, with Western hunter-gatherers, with populations coming in from the east. In most of Europe, the pure Anatolian farmer ancestry had diluted. People were a genetic blend, but not Ötzi. Skin pigmentation markers revealed that Ötzi had much more melanin in his skin than expected, making him darker than modern Sicilians. And his genome showed an unusually high proportion of Anatolian farmer ancestry, higher than virtually any of his contemporaries studied across Europe. He was not simply a man who lived in the Alps. He was a man who carried within his DNA a clearer, more concentrated echo of the ancient Near Eastern farmers who had seeded European civilization than almost anyone else alive at his time. And what made him even stranger was where he lived and the people who surrounded him. Because here's where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. A 2025 Nature Communications study analyzed the genomes of 47 people who lived in the Tyrolean Alps between the Mesolithic and the Middle Bronze Age, around 6400 to 1300 BC, to learn more about their ancestry. Otzi's ancestry was decidedly different from his neighbors. Scientists wanted to understand not just who Ötzi was, but who the people around him were. Were they genetically similar? Did he represent the typical alpine population of his era? Or was he something else? The results were astonishing. While Ötzi's neighbors, the people who lived in the same mountain valleys, breathed the same alpine air and walked the same rocky trails, shared broadly similar Anatolian farmer roots, there was a remarkable genetic stability in those communities over 2 millennia, and the communities in the Alps were not affected genetically by waves of immigrants and newcomers. Yet, when researchers looked more closely at Ötzi's specific lineage within that broader population, they found something that set him apart, even from his immediate neighbors. His specific genetic signature was different. He was part of the world he lived in, and yet he was not quite of it. Think about what that means. A man who was already the most genetically unusual individual in a population that was itself unusual by the standards of the wider continent. A man who, in a landscape of isolated alpine communities that had maintained extraordinary genetic continuity for thousands of years, somehow stood out as different. as a kind of genetic outlier even among outliers. And then someone killed him, because that is the other story here, the one that has haunted researchers since the day he was found. Ötzi was murdered. Ötzi died of blood loss after being shot with an arrow in his left shoulder. While researchers initially thought that he had died of exhaustion or exposure during his trek across the Alps, later studies found evidence of the violent nature of his demise. This discovery, that he had been shot, did not come immediately. For years after he was found, scientists assumed he had simply died of cold and exhaustion. It was only when radiographic imaging revealed an arrowhead buried deep in his left shoulder, lodged just beneath his shoulder blade, that the truth emerged. This was not an accident. This was not exposure. Someone had waited for the right moment, pulled back a bow, and shot this man in the back. And the forensic evidence tells us that the shooter was good. The angle and trajectory of the arrow indicate it was fired from a distance, from slightly below Ötzi's position, striking at an angle that would have caused catastrophic internal bleeding. This was not a random assault. This had the hallmarks of a deliberate, planned killing. The partially healed knife wound on his right hand indicates he had been in a fight several days before his death, perhaps injuring or killing someone from a rival clan. His attackers may have tracked him for days through the mountains, finally cornering him in the high Alps, where he made his last stand. And in his final hours, in the hours before the arrow found him, he ate a substantial meal. Otzi's last meal was determined to be ibex meat and fat, toxic bracken fern, red deer meat, and einkorn wheat. He was not starving. He was not desperate. He ate well, rested, and then, sometime shortly after, he was shot from behind at altitude, and his body fell into a gully in the glacier where it would remain undiscovered for 5,000 years. What most people are not seeing is the full scope of what the forensic evidence tells us about this man's life before his death. The Iceman had type O blood, was lactose intolerant, and had a rare genetic anomaly that prevented his 12th pair of ribs from forming. He suffered from cavities, intestinal parasites, Lyme disease, and sore knees, hips, shoulders, and back. His 61 tattoos map onto the places where his bones and joints show wear and tear, as well as onto modern acupuncture points. This is extraordinary. 61 tattoos, the oldest known tattooed human being in the world, and the tattoos are not decorative. They are medical. They are placed with precision at the exact points on the body where a modern acupuncturist would insert needles to relieve joint pain and inflammation. Studies showed strain-induced degeneration of Ötzi's bones, especially in his knees and ankles. Most of the tattoos are located on the meridians near the affected areas, precisely where a modern acupuncturist would insert the needles. This would push the known origin of acupuncture-like therapeutic practice back by 2,000 years beyond its previously documented emergence in China. A man who died 5,000 years ago was treating his arthritis with a technique that modern medicine still uses today. But he was not simply a mountain healer living a quiet life of pain management and ibex hunting. The angle and distance at which the arrow was fired points to a deliberate attempt to kill, according to researchers. The fact that Ötzi's valuable copper axe was left at the scene also seemed to rule out attempted robbery. His copper axe, the item that, in the Copper Age, would have been among the most valuable things a person could carry, a tool so rare and significant that its presence at his side suggested he was a man of considerable status, was left completely untouched beside his body. The person who killed him did not want his property. They wanted him dead, and they wanted only that. This was personal. This was a targeted execution. According to informed sources in the forensic archaeology community, this kind of deliberate targeted killing at altitude, combined with evidence of a prior altercation days before and the intentional abandonment of valuable possessions at the scene, points to a feud, a blood feud, the kind of violence that tears through communities not as a single event, but as a chain of retaliations, each one more deadly than the last. Otzi may have been a man running from something, or hunting someone, and in the end, someone caught up with him first. Now layer on top of all of that what the new DNA discoveries tell us about who he really was. A man with dark skin and dark eyes in a world where we assumed everyone looked like the pale-skinned Europeans we see today. A man who was more genetically connected to ancient Near Eastern farmers than almost anyone else in his era, even as he lived and apparently fought among the alpine communities of what is now northern Italy and Austria. A man who was so genetically unusual that even the isolated population surrounding him, itself a genetic island in prehistoric Europe, could not quite contain him within its patterns. The real story is this. Otzi was not representative of prehistoric Europe. He was an anomaly within an anomaly. A man who seems, based on everything we now know about his genome and his geography, to have come from or descended from a more isolated, more genetically concentrated ancestral lineage than his contemporaries. He was not the average ancient European. He may have been something closer to a genetic relic, a living echo of an even older ancestral pattern that was, by his time, already vanishing from the wider world. And then, in February 2026, came the discovery that nobody saw coming. In 2008, Genetic research suggested that Ötzi's maternal lineage was extinct. His mitochondrial DNA carried a rare signature never observed in any living person, leading researchers to conclude he likely had no modern-day matrilineal relatives. New findings from advanced genetic genealogy research now challenge that conclusion. For 18 years, the scientific consensus was unambiguous on this point. Otzi had no living relatives through the maternal line. His mitochondrial DNA, the genetic code that passes unchanged from mother to child across generations, belonged to a haplogroup so rare, so distinctive, that it existed nowhere in the modern world. Scientists labeled it K1F. They concluded it was extinct. Otzi was, in this sense, the last of his kind, the end of a line. That conclusion has now been overturned. Through modern genetic genealogy, family tree DNA researchers have identified a living man whose maternal DNA traces back to the same ancient lineage as Otzi, reconnecting a family line believed lost for millennia. And where this man comes from is the detail that transforms the entire story. That man is Hedi Abad, a French citizen whose maternal ancestry comes from northeastern Algeria. He originally tested to learn more about his roots. At first, I thought it was a joke, Hedi said, but when they explained the connection, I realized this was something extraordinary. Let that sink in for a moment. A man living in France, whose maternal grandmother belonged to the Shawaya Berber community of northeastern Algeria in North Africa, shares the same rare maternal genetic signature as a man found frozen in the Italian Alps, who died 5,300 years ago. A lineage that scientists declared extinct in 2008 had survived, invisibly, carried through the maternal lines of a North African Berber community, crossing millennia, continents, and the entire sweep of recorded human history. Hedi's DNA matches the two distinctive mutations previously seen only in Otzi, along with a few additional mutations that developed over thousands of years. This is not a distant connection. This is not a vague genetic similarity. The core signature is the same. The lineage is the same. Otzi's maternal family line did not die in the Alps 5,000 years ago. It survived. It moved. It traveled. Possibly through Mediterranean trade routes, possibly through the slow migrations of Neolithic farming populations across North Africa, and it ended up embedded in the genetic heritage of a Berber community in Algeria, where it quietly persisted across 250 generations until a man named Hedi Abad decided to take a DNA test to learn about his family history. What most people are not seeing is what this discovery implies about the scale of ancient human movement. This is not simply a story about one man and one mummy. This is a story about the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible reach of ancient human migration networks. The same ancestral line that produced a man who died in the Italian Alps during the Copper Age also produced descendants who made it to the coast of North Africa and embedded themselves in the Berber cultural tradition. The Alpine world and the North African world were not as separate as our modern geographic imagination suggests. These populations were connected. They shared ancestry. They shared lineages. And those connections have persisted invisibly in human DNA for 5,000 years, waiting to be discovered by a technology that did not exist until the 21st century. Hedi's maternal grandmother belonged to the Shawaya Berber community of northeastern Algeria. Berber populations represent a deep and complex blend of ancient North African ancestry from early Neolithic farmers who spread from the Near East into Europe and North Africa thousands of years ago. This helps explain how a maternal lineage associated with a man found in the Alps could survive in North Africa. The genetic trail runs from Anatolia into Europe and simultaneously into North Africa, carried by the same wave of Neolithic farmers who changed the world. Ötzi was one branch of that story. Hedi Abad is another, and the fact that those branches can be connected 5,000 years later by a mitochondrial DNA test is one of the most remarkable scientific demonstrations of human genetic continuity ever documented. UT, there is something even deeper here than the genetics, because every revelation about Otzi, every correction, every overturned assumption, every shocking new discovery, forces us to confront a broader truth about the limits of scientific confidence. And that truth is deeply uncomfortable. The scientists who studied Otzi in 2012 were not incompetent. They were not dishonest. They were working at the edge of what was possible, using the best tools available to them, and they produced conclusions that were accepted, published, celebrated, and embedded in the global scientific understanding of human prehistory. And they were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally wrong about his ancestry, wrong about his skin color, wrong about his hair, wrong about the extinction of his maternal lineage. The picture they built and the world believed for over a decade was, in almost every important respect, incorrect. And this is where the story stops being about one ancient man in a glacier and starts being about something much larger. Because if we were this wrong about Ötzi, a man we have been studying intensively for 33 years, whose every cell has been subjected to the most advanced scientific scrutiny available, Then the question becomes, what else have we gotten wrong? What other ancient individuals have we misread, misidentified, misrepresented? What other conclusions, accepted as settled truth in peer-reviewed journals, are waiting for better technology to come along and quietly demolish them? The answer, according to researchers working in archaeogenetics today, is many. The field of ancient DNA study has been revolutionized in just the last decade. The number of prehistoric genomes successfully sequenced has grown from dozens to tens of thousands. The technology for high-coverage genome sequencing has improved by orders of magnitude. Contamination detection has become far more sophisticated, and with every advance, the picture of ancient humanity becomes more complex, more surprising, and more humbling for the scientists who thought they had already figured it out. A 2025 Nature Communications study analyzed the DNA of 47 people who lived alongside Ötzi in the Austrian Tyrol between 6400 and 1300 BC to determine if they shared genomic similarities. The research indicated that, like Ötzi, 80 to 90% of these individuals' ancestry came from Neolithic farmers who had migrated to Europe during the Neolithic period. The results also showed that, after that time, there was a remarkable genetic stability over 2 millennia, and that communities in the Alps were not affected genetically by waves of immigrants and newcomers. This means that while the rest of Europe was being repeatedly reshaped by migration, first by early farmers from the Near East, then by steppe herders from the east, then by Bronze Age populations moving in from multiple directions, the high alpine communities held their ground. Genetically, they remained for over 2,000 years, remarkably unchanged. A pocket of preserved genetic heritage in the middle of a continent that was constantly in motion. And Otzi, with his extraordinarily high concentration of Anatolian farmer ancestry, was perhaps the most pure expression of that preserved heritage. A living fossil of an older human world, preserved not just in ice after his death, but in his very DNA while he was alive. And someone killed him anyway. The murder of Ötzi is the coldest cold case in human history, 5,300 years old, and it remains officially unsolved. We know the weapon, we know the wound, we know the approximate time of year, early summer, based on the pollen found in his digestive system, which told researchers he had traveled from the valley floor to the high alpine pass. We know his last meal. We know he had been in a fight days before. We know his killer shot him from behind at a distance, with accuracy and intention. His oldest known case of heart disease has been confirmed by CT scan, and his 61 tattoos map precisely onto the places where his body showed wear and damage. This was a man carrying the weight of a hard life. Arthritis, parasites, heart disease, broken bones healed and rebroken, and he died violently at the top of the world, watched by nobody, mourned by nobody that we know of, left to freeze in a gully that would seal his story for 5 millennia. What we do not know is why. We do not know the name of his killer. We do not know the nature of the conflict that led to the arrow in his back. We do not know whether the fight on his hand days before was connected to his death. We do not know whether he was fleeing or pursuing. We do not know whether the people who killed him knew what they were destroying. Not just a man, but an entire genetic lineage that was, by Otzi's own time, already becoming rare, already becoming the last of its kind. Or so we thought, until Hedi Abad took a DNA test in France and the world's oldest known murder case gained its most unexpected new chapter. Here is what the sum of all these discoveries forces us to ask. If the image of Ötzi built in the early years of his study was so dramatically wrong, if his skin, his hair, his ancestry, his genetic relationships, and even the assumed extinction of his lineage all turned out to require fundamental correction, then what does that tell us about the reliability of all the other stories we tell about human prehistory? How many other faces in other museums are built on the same kind of contaminated data, the same cultural biases, the same assumption that ancient people must have looked like the modern people who live in the same geography today? How many other extinct lineages are quietly waiting in a database somewhere, preserved in the DNA of a living person who has not yet thought to take a test? The ice is melting faster now. Glaciers across the Alps and around the world are retreating at an accelerating pace. And as they retreat, they are giving up their dead. Scientists estimate that dozens, possibly hundreds, of preserved human remains may emerge from alpine ice in the coming decades as the climate continues to warm. Each one of those bodies is potentially a Ötzi. Each one is a time capsule, a genetic archive, a story waiting to be read. And the science that will read those stories is evolving so rapidly that conclusions reached today may be overturned by better tools in 5 years, just as the conclusions of 2012 were overturned by 2023. The real story of Ötzi is not the story of one man who died in the Alps 5,000 years ago. The real story is what he reveals about the fragility of scientific certainty, about how easily the narrative of human history can be shaped by the limitations of the tools we use to study it, and by the assumptions we bring to the evidence before we even begin. For 30 years, we looked at a dark-skinned, balding, genetically unique ancient man and saw a pale-skinned, hairy European. We declared his lineage extinct, and a French Algerian man has been walking around for decades carrying that lineage in his cells. We built a story about who he was, and the story was wrong in almost every important dimension. Now we are rebuilding it, and every time we rebuild it, it becomes stranger, deeper, more complex, and more human. Because that is what Ötzi is, beneath all the science and all the mystery. He is a human being. He was sick, he was tattooed, he ate a good meal, and then someone shot him in the back. He had a mother, and that mother's line survived for 5,000 years in the mountains of North Africa, invisible to science until 18 months ago. What else is he hiding? What else is frozen in that genome that we haven't yet had the tools to find? What other lineages, what other migrations, what other connections between worlds we assumed were separate are waiting inside his ancient cells? The glacier gave him up in 1991. Science has been trying to read him ever since. And every time we think we finally understand him, every time we close the case and prepare to move on, Otzi reaches out from 5,000 years in the past and reminds us that we are still, in almost every meaningful way, just beginning.